Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Truman Forum. We're about to start our program, even though I see people still flocking in the back. But thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Alex Burden. I'm the Truman Library Institute's Executive Director. Struggling with the microphone. I'd like to welcome you to the exciting debut of Beyond the Gowns, a major new series focused on the oftentimes understudied and underappreciated role of America's First Ladies. The Truman Library Institute is proud to be working in partnership with the Kansas City Public Library to bring top-shelf presidential programming to the Truman Forum. Last year, we studied some of our nation's greatest presidents in Hail to the Chiefs, and more than 6,000 people enjoyed one of the 15 programs. Beyond the Gowns, which will be equally fascinating, explores the important role America's First Ladies have played in support of their country, their president, and their husband. President Truman himself called for such an analysis when he stated, "I hope someday someone will take the time to evaluate the true role of the First Lady and to assess the many burdens she has to bear and the contributions she makes." Bess Wallace Truman had a much more modest and private opinion about the role of First Ladies. She stated, "A woman's place in public is to sit beside her husband, be silent, and be sure her hat is on straight." And as my beloved grandmother used to say, "My, how times have changed." The reality, however, of Bess's role as First Lady was quite different. White House Chief Usher J.B. West, in his book Upstairs at the White House, described her approach. In public, Mrs. Truman never said a word. Bess Truman guarded her privacy like a precious jewel. And in that privacy was hidden a great secret involving the role she played in public life. A keenly intelligent, well-educated, politically experienced person, Mrs. Truman knew her politics, and her husband respected her opinion. In fact, a favorite public nickname for Bess was the boss. So thank you for allowing me to stray into the world of the Trumans. I can't get at a microphone and not talk about the Trumans and the Truman Library. You can learn more about Harry, Bess, and their relationship at the Truman Library, 14 miles away. And I encourage you to visit us in Independence. I'd like to conclude by thanking Crosby Kemper, Henry Fortunato, and the Public Library staff for all of their efforts and for providing us with such a wonderful venue for these lectures. I also want to thank the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation for the generous grant it provided that made this series possible. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'd now like to introduce Henry Fortunato. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you all for being here. Alex hit just the right note a moment ago when he mentioned the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. The real kudos for tonight, as well as for the launching of the Beyond the Gowns series, belong to the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. For many years, Kauffman has provided extremely generous support to the Kansas City Public Library, and more recently to the Truman Library Institute. That funding is and remains absolutely critical to the development and execution of these public programs. For the library in particular, this support has allowed us to experiment, to make small bets, to learn from our mistakes, and to build on our successes. In other words, it's allowed us to be entrepreneurial. In the process, we've been able to develop a fairly extensive infrastructure that enables programs in series like these to take place day after day, week after week, month after month, and to see many of you over and over again. As a result, the citizens of Greater Kansas City now enjoy exceptional opportunities to engage and converse with historians, economists, novelists, leading academics from multiple disciplines, and eminent journalists. Which brings us to tonight's speaker. I've known Carl Cannon for more than a quarter of a century. That's kind of scary, but it's true. During that time, Carl has become one of the most prolific and insightful reporters covering the Washington scene. He has been writing about presidents and first ladies since the Ford administration for such publications as the San Jose Mercury News, the Baltimore Sun, National Journal, Reader's Digest, and PoliticsDaily.com. For the past 2 years, he's been the Washington editor of Real Clear Politics. Along the way, he received the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for Distinguished Reporting and the Aldo Beckman Award, the two most prestigious awards for White House coverage. In his spare time, he's written several books, including a study of Karl Rove, and with his father, Lou Cannon, the former Washington Post White House correspondent, an examination of President George W. Bush called Reagan's Disciple. He was here about 2 years ago to talk about that book. So last July of 2012, over libations at one of our favorite taverns in Georgetown, I told Carl about our it was then proposed, Beyond the Gowns series. He immediately volunteered to come to Kansas City and to give us an original talk. It was prepared just for this audience on Michelle Obama. He has shared a few snippets of it with me, so I can tell you this. Carl sees the present First Lady as a compelling cross between an American original and the ideal 21st century inheritor of a position that ranks as the most important unpaid job in the world. I think we are all about to have a most enlightening evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carl Cannon.
Thank you for the introduction, for having me here. All right, what we're going to do first, I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show it to you, the expert AV people are going to show it to you, a clip that's been on YouTube. Many of you have seen it already. If you have, you know you won't mind watching it again. For those who haven't seen it, just enjoy. It'll take about 3 or 4 minutes, but it won't take that long to do it. We're going to do it right now, and then I'll start talking. While they're setting that up, let me confess one thing. Here's how long I've been in Washington and how nerdy you get. I watched that, and a lot of friends watched it and said they didn't realize it was Mrs. Obama right away. Well, I knew instantly it was Mrs. Obama, but I thought, who's that kind of homely white woman? I did not recognize her, and so it turns out it was Jimmy Fallon. I only had to see the show twice and have it be the Jimmy Fallon show before it hit me. While they're setting up, I'm actually going to be behind that lectern in a moment, but I'll just go ahead and start because you guys have been patient and big crowd. The Washington Post, my hometown paper now where I live, and famous newspaper covering the president, as of this week, no longer has an ombudsman on its staff. It was a job Ben Bagdikian had it, many famous people. And for cost-cutting reasons, they don't have an ombudsman anymore. But they still have a dance critic. And I'm not questioning their priorities. That's a well-run paper. Her name is Sarah Kaufman. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and she usually writes about classical dance. But ready for me over here? But if you have a dance critic on your staff, and you publish a paper in the nation's capital, and you see a first lady do something like that, then you have your dance critic weigh in. And she did. And here's what Sarah Kaufman wrote. She said, "Forget the new hairdo. Michelle Obama's most powerful bangs come from her hips." She went on, in a ghastly pink cardi and pedal pusher chinos, Fallon was having his own hair moment while unlocking a devastatingly creaky portrayal of self-conscious uncool. Then Michelle Obama swivels in her own cardi, and yes, pedal pushers, way spiffier, natch, but would she truly represent? They needn't have worried, says the dance critic. Of course we knew Obama could dance, she said, and she linked to another clip of the mover-in-chief, that's what she called her, shimmying at a D.C. middle school to Beyonce's Move Your Body. 4.5 years ago, we took a huge step in this country, and I don't say that as a Democrat. I'm utterly nonpartisan, as you'll come to see. And besides, no less prominent Republican as George W. Bush and Laura Bush admitted that they were caught up in the historic high of electing an African-American president. Some black Democrats in this country, particularly if they were supporting Hillary Clinton, groused quietly, mostly among themselves, that Barack Obama... Pardon? How about that? Okay. All right. I don't usually like heckling, but thank you. Some black Democrats, particularly if they were supporting Hillary, groused among themselves that Barack Obama, with his white mother, Nigerian father, Hawaiian and Indonesian upbringing, and boarding schools, had not come out of the authentic American black tradition. This was true as far as it went, I suppose, the icing on the cake being that he had ancestors who were slave owners, not slaves. They were on his mother's side. But Michelle Obama, now there's the genuine article, at least by the lights of conventional thinking, you know. In the presidential election of 2008, brought an African-American woman and 2 African-American children into the White House. Not as servants. Remember, this building had been partially built by African Americans, both free and slave, but as the representative, the epitome of the government for, by, and of the people. And we should remember, you know, that prior to that, blacks had a long history visiting the White House. They are now living there. And to show one ways that Obamas, they never commented on this, but a subtle way that they revealed how momentous they thought this was. The official portrait of the first term, there's going to be another one in the second term, of Michelle Obama, has her standing there in a black dress, and behind is, of all the photographs in the White House, there's one that you can see. And it's, that's the one likeness is discernible, and it's Thomas Jefferson. I submit to you, he's the man who in a single man, epitomizes the tension that was always present between the noble ideals of America's founding and its less than noble practices. Jefferson's visible, but he's out of focus, as though he were fading. Nancy Pelosi has told the story of being welcomed to the White House by George W. Bush when she became the first female Speaker of the House. In her telling, the sound of Bush's voice faded away. Some people find that Texas lilt very pleasant, others don't. I like it. I think Pelosi likes it less than I do. But in her telling, the president's voice fades away, and she begins hearing spectral voices from the past. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth. And they're whispering, this cacophony of ghosts, and they're whispering to her, "At last we have a seat at the table." Now, this was reported in some quarters as Pelosi seeing visions. I've known Nancy a long time. We're both from, she grew up in Baltimore, but we're both from San Francisco. And I assume she's speaking metaphorically, as do her audiences, because they laugh along with her. But maybe not. Only 4 weeks after arriving in the White House, Hillary Clinton used similar language to say that she was channeling Eleanor Roosevelt. Turned out later, when things were dark, at a dark time for her in her marriage and her life in the White House, she actually saw a New Age medium to try and facilitate these conversations. So, yeah, sometimes you don't know whether to be literal or metaphorical when politicians speak. But what would Eleanor Roosevelt tell Hillary Rodham Clinton? In Mrs. Clinton's telling, it was mostly to toughen up, to have the hide of a rhinoceros, a phrase that Hillary Clinton used, and that Eleanor Roosevelt used herself in a column that she wrote. But the real Eleanor also knew, even before she came to live in the White House, that the job of First Lady had driven many of her predecessors to despair, depression even, and that she often needed someone to buck herself up. No woman entering the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt once said, can lightheartedly take up residence there. Today, however, the mover-in-chief lives there, a tall, beautiful, smart woman who is also a Harvard-trained lawyer, who is also the mother of school-age daughters, whom she encourages to eat well, along with the rest of the country's kids, who not only dances on the Jimmy Fallon show, but does push-ups with Ellen DeGeneres on her show, and spontaneously challenges reporters to foot races on the White House, on the South Lawn of the White House. That happened to a friend of mine, Lynn Sweet, and who hands out the Best Picture prize the night of the Academy Awards. This is not your mother's or grandmother's first lady. Or is she? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Before I go any further, though, I'd like to mention two things. The first is that although I'm going to be talking mostly tonight about Michelle Obama, I'm going to do it in the context of that office, of the women who've been there before, and who held the job before her. And we will get to we can get to the issue later. If I'll get to it, and if you have questions, we'll have some question and answer too, and we can talk about what Michelle might do after she leaves the White House, if you like. But I think it's important to know where she fits in, so we know how to think about her. I think in terms of American history, where she fits into these women who came before her, and because it's too easy to be glib and say that she's profoundly changed the office. She's different than anybody who ever came before her. I mean, in one sense, that's literally true, and it's a defensible view in the other sense. But it shouldn't be offered up as an article of faith. We shouldn't think about her in a vacuum. That doesn't do her any service either. And I'll give you a quick test to show what I'm talking about. I'm going to ask you a question for a series of firsts. First time First Lady does. Please don't shout out the answers, the guy who straightened me out on the mic, but just think to yourself what the answer might be, and then I will tell you after. All right, ready? Who was the first First Lady to be criticized in the newspapers? Who was the first First Lady to be profiled in a woman's magazine? Who was the first to advise female relatives to avoid having to rely on men? Who was the first to raise money for troops, the first to offer her advice to a successor, the first once out of office to let it be known that she didn't particularly appreciate a current president's digs at his predecessors? All right, it's a bit of a trick question. That's all Martha Washington. That is Martha Washington. The second point I'll make before I go any further is that for those of you who don't know my work, in Washington I'm considered the last of the bison, I suppose, a journalist who isn't partisan and who finds it easy to say positive things about Ronald Reagan and Franklin Roosevelt. Now, this is especially true for first ladies, who, I think Henry Fortunato pointed out, they don't seek the office, they're never paid for their service, and nor that they don't run against one another. Franklin Roosevelt had to beat Herbert Hoover to be president, but Eleanor Roosevelt didn't have to beat Lou Hoover to be First Lady. And when looking back, I think it's easy for us, if we're charitable people, to admire both Lou Hoover and Eleanor Roosevelt for their contributions. I'm not suggesting that all First Ladies are equal, or that they are the same, or that they even like the job equally. Even generalizing is perilous. Usually, for instance, First Ladies were more moderate politically than their husbands. But that's not always true. It wasn't true of Eleanor, that's for sure. She and Franklin argued over civil rights. And sometimes those arguments spilled into public. She sometimes would challenge him, not directly, but she'd write in her column advocating something that he was opposed to, and people knew it. According to Southern Democrats, FDR wouldn't even support an anti-lynching plank in the Democratic platform. Eleanor was for that. And it was Hillary Clinton, not Bill Clinton, who employed the language vast right-wing conspiracy. Which reminds me, First Ladies are usually more tactful than their husbands. Usually. This is a trait that has served them well. That comes directly from Dolly Madison, to whom all First Ladies owe so much. Dolly got an early start on things. She helped Martha Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a widower, and she helped him, Jefferson's niece, I guess, Martha, with official duties before James Madison was president. She helped, she served First Lady all 8 years James Madison was president, and she counseled those who came later, including Sarah Polk, as I mentioned. When she died in 1849, Zachary Taylor eulogized Dolly as the first lady of the land for a century. That was the first recorded use of that exact phrase. Now, century was a bit of a stretch. Dolly was 81 when she died. But Taylor wasn't exaggerating how much she was adored. One secret to her success was that tact I mentioned. At an 1838 New Year's Eve party, the great Henry Clay, now this is long after Dolly had left the White House, came up to her. History does not record whether he had had a couple of drinks, but Henry Clay said, "Everybody loves Mrs. Madison." And Dolly smiled and said, very truthfully, "Mr. Clay, I love everybody." But that's not a model all First Ladies followed. Martha Washington and Abigail Adams were both outspoken of their dislike of one early president, the same one as it happens, TJ, Thomas Jefferson. Abigail was opinionated on a great deal of matters and could be every bit as vitriolic as the acerbic John Adams. So much so that John Adams once gently reminded his wife, "We must hold our tongues." We aren't privy yet to those kinds of private communications between Barack and Michelle Obama. But her diplomacy and rhetorical skill, her charisma was never really in doubt, have grown before our eyes. In an unguarded moment on the 2008 campaign trail, Michelle said this: "For the first time in my adult life, I am really proud of my country." People jumped on that, not only Republicans. Her defenders were quick to point out that this was a partial quote, and they were right. The entire sentence was, "For the first time in my adult life, I am really proud of my country because it feels like hope is finally making a comeback." Even then, that was not a Dolly-esque statement, and so the president and, the Senator Obama and his wife later issued clarifying remarks that said what she was really talking about was that the Obama campaign candidacy was inspiring people to vote, especially young people. Fair enough, but what she also seemed to be saying was that she was proud of her country because an African-American presidential candidate was winning primaries and seemed on his way to winning his party's nomination. And guess what? A lot of people of color felt that way too, a point we'll return to. First, let's fast forward to last month. Everyone here knows about the tragedy at the elementary school in Newtown, New York, last December, and that it jump-started the conversation in this country about gun control. In her public remarks, Mrs. Obama has revealed that she understands there's no glib answer to gun violence. And she feels this particularly acutely because Chicago has had an epidemic of shootings going back 5 or 6 years. They have lost 270 school children since 2007. That's a Sandy Hook Elementary every 6 months for 5 or 6 years. One of the girls killed was recently was a young 15-year-old honor student who marched in the Obama inauguration parade. Now, many intemperate things have been said about gun control in the last couple of months, not all of them by the National Rifle Association. But Mrs. Obama's comments were not among them. I mean, she's been thoughtful and poignant. We have to stop, this is a quote from her recently, "We have to stop just telling our kids that we care. She said, they look at us to make the hard choices for them. And going to these funerals and mourning with these kids when there's still work to do that we haven't done, it can be frustrating." Now, some people criticized her for that on the left now, the kind of people, the opposite, who criticized her for the proud of my country remark. But what that showed to me, I submit to you, was a woman who'd grown in office and realized that she's not speaking to a segment of the population, but to the whole country. I also submit to you that's the hallmark of a kind of first lady who leaves her mark. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson and her brother grew up in Chicago on the South Side. Her father, Frazier, worked for the Chicago Water Department, and despite having multiple sclerosis, rarely missed a day of work. Their mother, Marion, stayed home. The kids, their job was to get good grades in school and stay out of trouble. And Michelle and Craig Robinson did this, particularly Michelle. She went on to Princeton, got excellent grades and scholarships. Her years there were apparently not completely gratifying to her. She studied sociology and African-American studies at Princeton. Those departments are imbued with the kind of identity politics that one can imagine. And so in her senior thesis, Michelle Robinson wrote that although she'd come from a black working-class neighborhood in Chicago, quote, "My experiences at Princeton have made me far more aware of my blackness than ever before. I have found that at Princeton, no matter how liberal and open-minded some of my white professors and classmates try to be towards me, I sometimes feel like a visitor on campus, as if I really don't belong. Regardless of the circumstances under which I interact with whites at Princeton, it often seems as if to them I will always be black first and a student second." End quote. She further suggests that even if she assimilates into white society after Princeton, she will, quote, "remain on the periphery of society, never becoming a full participant," end quote. From there, Michelle went on to Harvard Law School, which was then imbued with doctrines such as critical race theory and other, free-floating radicalism that one finds on a college campus and remembers from one's youth semi-fondly. Professors who smoked dope and, had long hair and let you slide on grades weren't all bad. But Michelle was a serious person, and she went on then to a law firm in Chicago, Sidley and Austin, establishment law firm. It was there that she met Barack Obama, who had attended Harvard after she left. According to Liza Mundy, the author of a mostly friendly biography of Michelle, politicians were never respected in Michelle's family. Little wonder, Illinois' politics is the most corrupt in the country. Chicago is and the Daily Machine is at the epicenter of that corruption. But a couple of developments seem to have altered Michelle's antipathy to politicians. One of them was she herself going to work as an assistant commissioner in the city's Department of Planning and Development. The other was the arrival in her life of Barack Obama himself. Now, here was a man, whatever your politics, who was clearly not on the make for handouts or payola, idealistic, maybe to a fault, and not into patronage, didn't even play that game. So he could do good in the world. He was a guy that would pass muster with Michelle's mother and her brother, and he did. From there, she went to the University of Chicago as an associate dean of student services, and later, as her husband was becoming prominent in Democratic Party politics in Chicago, she went to work as a communications specialist at the University of Chicago Medical Center. And as far as anyone knows, the first time she ever earned less money than her husband was when he became president of the United States. It wasn't a job that she envisioned for him. Before he won in 2008, Michelle Obama had never set foot in the White House. Those close to the family have been pretty open about saying that she didn't want him to run for the president and really didn't think he would win, and feared that even if he did, it would be a strain on her and her young children. She also, the person who'd grown up into a very poised professional lawyer and bureaucrat and communication specialist, was still the woman who'd written that thesis at Princeton, and she wasn't sure that she wanted race and her views about race to be front and center and to be talking about them publicly in front of the country. She was worried about the fishbowl effect of Washington as well, which anyone can imagine. She wasn't sure she wanted to be America's #1 volunteer. She was worried about leaving her mother behind in Chicago, a problem they solved by bringing their mother with them to the White House. That was then. Well, look at her now. She clearly relishes the spotlight. Some wags said after the Academy Awards that she may love it too much. I was not one of those critics. She's warmer than her introverted, even diffident husband. And although turnover among aides in the East Wing suggests she's not easy to work for, she has a warm and winning way with the public. Lynn Sweet, the woman I mentioned before, who Michelle elbow and said, "Let's race across the South Lawn." She's a journalistic institution who covers Washington for the Chicago Sun-Times, and she knows both Obamas well. I called Lynn last night just to make sure I wasn't going to forget something that I needed to mention to you, and she compared the Mrs. Obama of 2008 and today's version as the difference between an insecure high school freshman and the young woman who was voted the most popular her senior year and is heading off to university to go to the best school, been pledged by the best sorority, and has the coolest boyfriend. Now, that analogy is evocative. It's not exact. Mrs. Obama isn't heading anywhere, not soon anywhere. But she has embraced the celebrity aspect of her position, as well as the unofficial but important role of defining a signature issue or two. She's dubbed the first of them "Let's Move," which is all about exercise and eating right and getting kids out of the house. It started as an anti-obesity campaign for kids and has grown into an entire wellness regimen. The other is called Joining Forces, and it's about showing solicitude for military families, most specifically connecting U.S. servicemen and women, veterans, and their spouses with the resources they need to find a job when they come home, when they muster out a uniform. So she begins her second term. How does she measure up, historically speaking? I'd say we should consider some of her predecessors. So let's think about that for a minute. Let's start with this. How does she fit in the pantheon? Is she middle of the pack? Is she revolutionary? Is she unique? She just carrying the baton? My answer, and I hope you won't find this a cop-out, is all of that. It's all of those things. Let's take her two initiatives for a moment. Minding the troops and their families. Well, who's the first to do that? As I mentioned to you, it was Martha Washington. And she did this before George Washington was president. Martha traveled with her husband for much of the Revolutionary War and spent a lot of time at camp with rank-and-file soldiers. It was easier for her to talk to them than it was George Washington. George Washington had an idea about leadership that has the benefit of having withstood this test of time, that you can be neither too close, you can't get too close to your troops, and you can't be too distant either. There has to be some remove there, but not so much so that they won't follow you. Well, that wasn't the problem for Martha. She could be whatever she wanted to be, and she had a big heart. And so in June of 1780, following a harsh winter for the Continental Army, Martha Washington helped launch a campaign with other women of the time to provide direct aid to soldiers of the Continental Army. She not only helped collect money and goods and distribute them, but I called Mount Vernon, and the account books there show that Mrs. Washington herself may have donated as much as $20,000, a tremendous sum in those days, to the effort. And what about Michelle Obama's healthy lifestyle initiative? Is there a precedent for that? You betcha. But here's the rub. It was a president, not a first lady, who pushed it. His name was John F. Kennedy. And there's a couple of people my age in the audience who remember the 50-mile hikes and the presidential fitness thing in gym class where you had to do all those push-ups and all that other stuff. That was Jack Kennedy's idea. Nobody called him a nanny state scold, as I recall. That example goes, in my mind, to the heart of how the First Lady, the roles have evolved in this country, in and out of the White House, really about gender, and how public perceptions have changed along with it. Many of you know how Dolly Madison rescued the portrait of George Washington from a burning White House, the Gilbert Stuart painting. What you may not know is that as British troops put the city to the torch, mobs of Washingtonians gathered around them, and you could have had a riot. They didn't riot because the redcoats had all these muskets and well-drilled, but so the Washingtonians started heckling them. And one man called out to Admiral Coburn, who was the leader of the British troops, "You wouldn't be doing that if George Washington was here." And Coburn, a career military man, turned and said, "Sir, if George Washington were alive, we would not have even thought of coming here." That's what a badass he was. But I imagine, with hindsight, 200 years later almost, 200 years, that if Admiral Coburn had known her better, he might have expressed a similar sentiment for Dolly Madison. And there's no telling what an 18th century military man would have made of Eleanor Roosevelt's passions, Hillary Clinton's ambition, or the mere presence of Michelle Obama. Yes, she's the only African-American First Lady, a distinction so important it can hardly be overemphasized, and only the second Ivy League-trained lawyer. She's also, as I like to think of it, sort of the not the first post-feminist First Lady, because that's a loaded term, but the first one who grew up with Title IX as the law and custom of the land. She herself wasn't an athlete in high school or college, like her brother and her husband, but she exhibits confidence not only in her intellect, but also her physique, that it's palatable in the way she walks, dances, dresses, shows off those buff arms, and even stands. She's a tall woman who does not slouch. She's quietly proud of herself in a way that inspires women and girls, particularly if they are black. I was on Steve Kraski's radio show this morning here in Kansas City, and we received 2 calls, and I'm sure there were many more people on the line, from black women who told us that precisely. One was 40 years old, and she said flatly that she said wistfully that she wished Michelle had been First Lady when she was a girl. So yes, that's new, and it is revolutionary. I'll offer a couple of other observations and then open up to questions. You can ask about Michelle Obama or any First Lady. My friend Henry Fortunato will probably admonish you to actually pose a question instead of making a speech. So listen. All right. First, outwardly, because we're here in Missouri, this is almost a caveat, but it's a good one. It's hard to imagine 2 First Ladies more different than Michelle Obama and Bess Truman. When Bess got the job, first thing she did was discontinue Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. She asked somebody, do I have to do the press conferences? No, you don't. Well, she didn't. Bess Truman loved her time as a Senate wife, and Harry Truman, we have Truman experts here, so I'm not going to talk all that much about Harry Truman, but he considered the greatest 10 years of his career also in the Senate, and Bess liked the camaraderie of the Senate wives. She wouldn't find that today, but the loneliness of the White House, the way it was, and then they were rebuilding it. She had very strong family pulls, bringing her back here, tension, things with her mother. But I wanted to think in a way that Bess Truman was like Michelle Obama. And I remembered, a friend of mine wrote a book about presidents in baseball. Harry Truman was no kind of athlete. He had thick Coke bottle glasses. He couldn't have hit a baseball at all. But Bess Truman was a terrific third baseman. She was a good baseball player. This got me to thinking, so I called Clifton Truman Daniel, a name many of you know. He's the grandson of Harry and Bess Truman. And I asked him about the baseball thing. And I was trying to get him around to, dancing moms. And, I had this idea the way you do when you're writing a speech. Maybe it will come together. Kind of did. Not dancing, but Bess Truman, Clifton said, played tennis and golf, and she was good. But she was also and he said, and she could throw a haymaker if you got her mad. I did not pursue that line of inquiry, so you don't have to go there. But he said that Clark Clifford, the great statesman and Truman confidant, told him this story, that once they were in the White House having a dinner party, and the 4 of them were there, and maybe another couple. There may be people in this audience who know this story better than I do, but I'm going to continue anyway because I have the lectern. And Harry started sort of gently needling Bess, really, saying, she was a letterman. And Clark Clifford said, oh, what sport? And Bess Truman was saying, Harry, in a warning kind of way, no, Harry. But he pursued, and Clark Clifford got so curious, he finally said, what sport? And Harry Truman said, shot put. She lettered in shot put. So throwing the shot around the turn of the century is not quite the same as dancing with Jimmy Fallon. But at least I think we can add Bess Truman to the list of first ladies who Admiral Coburn wouldn't have wanted to run into in a dark Washington alley. The other thing that Michelle Obama, that people want to talk about lately when you bring up Michelle Obama, is whether her evolution as First Lady into this charismatic person who sort of seems to relish the role implies political ambitions of her own. I wondered that myself after watching the Academy Awards. I hope I'm not leaping to any conclusions, but I had a conversation with Hillary Clinton when she was still First Lady that really opened my eyes. One way about thinking about First Ladies, and we're talking about First Ladies beyond the gown, and you'll be talking about it I hope you come to the other lectures as well, is people lump them into camps, traditional First Ladies, and then I guess, feminist First Ladies. I don't know what the other thing is, but we know who's in it. Eleanor's in it, and Hillary Clinton certainly. But I think that a better way to think about it is maybe. Well, let me back up a minute. I think that's a misnomer, actually. The more you learn about First Ladies, the more you realize that they wield power in all kinds of ways. It's not just one or the other. Pillow talk goes a long way, and it can be about foreign policy, domestic policy, White House personnel, anything. Sarah Polk, as I mentioned, consulted with Dolly Madison. Well, she consulted with her how to throw White House parties. But she also helped James K. Polk write speeches, the First Lady to do that. Harriet Lane, niece of the unmarried James Buchanan, and the first person to whom the phrase First Lady was applied in print, gave her art to the country, thus establishing the National Gallery of Art. She also endowed what would become Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Caroline Harrison, another First Lady, raised money for Johns Hopkins, but only on the condition that it admit women, which it did. Frances Cleveland, beautiful and only 21, the first woman married at the White House, held receptions and encouraged working women to attend them. Edith Roosevelt tapped her fingers on the table when Theodore went on too long in front of dinner guests. Florence Harding broke with tradition, actively campaigned for women's rights. She also campaigned to cut energy consumption in the White House, a cause later embraced by Jimmy Carter. Edith Wilson ran the White House after her husband had a stroke, all the while insisting she had no political aims of her own, and was called Mrs. President for her troubles. It was not intended as a compliment. Publicity side Jackie Kennedy opened up the White House for a television tour, and in the process opened herself up to a journey that established her as one of the most influential forces in historic preservation in this country. There are people involved in that field today who were born long after the Kennedy presidency, who owe Jackie a debt. Lady Bird Johnson worked to beautify America, perhaps the most successful First Lady initiative in history, and in the process helped give liftoff to the environmental movement. Betty Ford campaigned for the Equal Rights Amendment and is now remembered more now for her candor in talking about the twin scourges of addiction and breast cancer. And although Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs campaign met with limited success, recent scholarship by Alida Black and others shows that she was also busy helping her husband end the Cold War. And that's an example of what I meant about there's no real, the distinction between traditional First Ladies, to me, is a phony one. Nancy Reagan was widely pilloried, for that Nancy gaze where she looked up at her husband like she's looking at the Messiah. Remember that? Attacked for it, really. Imagine that. We live in a country attacked for loving your spouse, but I digress. And Nancy didn't have any aims of her own, didn't see herself as a political person outside of Ronald Reagan, except that she was fiercely protective of his reputation. And there was a battle going on in the White House, several of them, really. And they were battles not fought for any nefarious purposes. They were battles between different ideologies. And there were hardliners on the Soviets, and there were people who thought that Reagan should negotiate. Nancy was protective of her husband. She didn't pretend to know more about arms control than anybody else, but she knew that Reagan cared deeply about it. So she nudged Reagan, she encouraged him to negotiate with Gorbachev. And all those people who worked in the White House who loved Reagan, they called it the Reagan Revolution. These people, we called them Reaganites. They called themselves Reaganauts. They loved the guy. But Ronald Reagan knew that there was one person in that building who really had his interest and only his interest at heart, and it was Nancy. And so he listened to her. So there's a traditional first lady having an impact in a very non-traditional way, foreign policy. One more word about Nancy, I'd say. Jimmy Fallon was 7 years old when Nancy wowed him at the Gridiron Dinner in Washington by doing a hilarious song and dance number. I think it was called Secondhand Clothes. It was a takeoff on Secondhand Rose, and she was making fun of herself for her own expensive taste, and she'd been the subject of some embarrassing stories. That started the process of Nancy winning over the hearts and minds of the press, and that can be difficult to do. A process that was completed by her bravery in facing Ronald Reagan's battle with Alzheimer's. Laura Bush, certainly a traditionally seeming first lady, championed literacy in the arts and the rights of women and girls in places like Afghanistan. Yet you got the feeling she was happy to return to Texas and private life. Which model will Michelle Obama embrace? As first ladies, Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary both denied aspirations of wielding power on their own. We know that this was not entirely true. In a letter to her companion, Lorena Hickok, Eleanor mentioned that political strategist Lewis Howe, one of the few people in America who managed to be an ally of both Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. Think about that. Lewis Howe had told her that he wanted to make her president after Franklin left the White House, and Eleanor wrote, and he insisted he could do it. As for Hillary, she revealed her own ambitions before her husband ever left the White House. So that leaves us with, well, what the kids would say, WWMD. What will Michelle do? All I can say is stay tuned.